The Story of Pocahontas by Charles Dudley Warner. Part 1. The simple story of the life of Pocahontas is sufficiently romantic without the embellishments which have been wrought on it either by the vanity of Captain Smith or the natural pride of the descendants of this dusky princess, who have been ennobled by the smallest rivulet of her red blood. That she was the child of a remarkable intelligence, and that she early showed a tender regard for the whites and rendered them willing and unwilling service, is the concurrent evidence of all the contemporary testimony. That as a child she was well-favored, sprightly, and prepossessing above all her copper-colored companions, we can believe, and that as a woman her manners were attractive. If the portrait taken of her in London, the best engraving, which is by Simon de Passe in 1616, when she is said to have been 21 years old, does her justice. She had marked Indian features. The first mention of her is in The True Relation, written by Captain Smith in Virginia in 1608. In this narrative, as our readers have seen, she is not referred to until after Smith's return from the captivity in which Powhatan uses him with all the kindness he could devise. Her name first appears toward the close of the relation in the following sentence. Powhatan, understanding we detained certain salvages, sent his daughter, a child of 10 years old, which not only for feature, countenance, and proportion much exceedeth any of the rest of his people, but for wit and spirit the only nonpareil of his country, this he sent by his most trusty messenger, called Rawhunt, as much exceeding in deformity of person, but of a subtle wit and crafty understanding. He, with a long circumstance, told me how well Powhatan loved and respected me, and in that I should not doubt any way of his kindness, he had sent his child, which he most esteemed, to see me, a deer, and bread, besides for a present, desiring me that the boy, Thomas Savage, the boy given by Newport to Powhatan, might come again, which he loved exceedingly. His little daughter he had taught this lesson also, not taking notice at all of the Indians that had been prisoners 3 days, till that morning that she saw their fathers and friends come quietly and in good terms to entreat their liberty. In the afternoon they, the friends of the prisoners, being gone, we guarded them, the prisoners, as before to the church, and after prayer, gave them to Pocahontas, the king's daughter, in regard of her father's kindness in sending her. After having well fed them, as all the time of their imprisonment, we gave them their bows, arrows, or what else they had, and with much content sent them packing. Pocahontas we all requited, with such trifles as contented to her, to tell that we had used the Paspahegans very kindly in so releasing them. The next allusion to her is in the 4th chapter of the narratives which are appended to the Map of Virginia, etc. This was sent home by Smith with a description of Virginia in the late autumn of 1608. It was published at Oxford in 1612, from 2 to 3 years after Smith's return to England. The appendix contains the narratives of several of Smith's companions to Virginia, edited by Dr. Simons and overlooked by Smith. In one of these is a brief reference to the above-quoted incident. This Oxford tract, it is scarcely necessary to repeat, contains no reference to the saving of Smith's life by Pocahontas from the clubs of Powhatan. The next published mention of Pocahontas, in point of time, is in Chapter 10, and the last of the appendix to the Map of Virginia, and is Smith's denial, already quoted, of his intention to marry Pocahontas. In this passage, he speaks of her as, at most, not past 13 or 14 years of age. If she was 13 or 14 in 1609, when Smith left Virginia, she must have been more than 10 when he wrote his True Relation, composed in the winter of 1608, which in all probability was carried to England by Captain Nelson, who left Jamestown June 2nd. The next contemporary authority to be consulted in regards to Pocahontas is William Strachey, who, as we have seen, went with the expedition of Gates and Somers, was shipwrecked on the Bermudas, and reached Jamestown May 23rd or 24th, 1610, and was made secretary and recorder of the colony under Lord Delaware. Of the origin and life of Strachey, who was a person of importance in Virginia, little is known. The better impression is that he was the William Strachey of Saffron Walden, who was married in 1588 and was living in 1620, and that it was his grandson of the same name who was subsequently connected with the Virginia colony. He was, judged by his writings, a man of considerable education, a good deal of pedant, and shared the credulity and fondness for embellishment of the writers of his time. His connection with Lord Delaware and his part in framing the Code of Laws of Virginia, which may be inferred from the fact that he first published them, showed that he was a trusted and capable man. William Strachey left behind him a manuscript entitled The History of Travail into Virginia, Britannica, etc., gathered and observed as well by those who went first thither as collected by William Strachey. 3 years thither employed as Secretary of State. How long he remained in Virginia is uncertain, but it could not have been 3 years, though he may have continued secretary for that period, for he was in London in 1612, in which year he published there the Laws of Virginia, which had been established by Sir Thomas Gates, May 24th, 1610, approved by Lord Delaware, June 10th, 1610, and enlarged by Sir Thomas Dale, June 22nd, 1611. The Travail was first published by the Hakluyt Society in 1849. When and where it was written, and whether it was all composed at one time, are matters of dispute. The first book, descriptive of Virginia and its people, is complete. The second book, a narration of discoveries in America, is unfinished. Only the first book concerns us. That Strachey made notes in Virginia may be assumed, but the book was no doubt written after his return to England. This code of laws, with its penalty of whipping and death for what are held now to be venial offenses, gives it a high place among the black codes. One clause will suffice. Every man and woman duly twice a day upon the first tolling of the bell shall upon the working days repair unto the church to hear divine service upon pain of losing his or her allowance for the first omission, for the second to be whipped, and for the third to be condemned to the galleys for 6 months. Likewise, no man or woman shall dare to violate the Sabbath by any gaming, public or private, abroad or at home, but duly sanctify and observe the same, both himself and his family, by preparing themselves at home with private prayer, that they may be the better fitted for the public, according to the commandments of God and the orders of our church, as also every man and woman shall repair in the morning to the divine service and sermons preached upon the Sabbath day, and in the afternoon to divine service and catechism upon pain for the first fault to lose the provision and allowance for the whole week following, for the second to lose the said allowance and also to be whipped, and for the third to suffer death. Was it written before or after the publication of Smith's Map and Description at Oxford in 1612? The question is important because Smith's description and Strachey's travail are page after page literally the same. One was taken from each other. Commonly, at the time, manuscripts seem to have been passed around and much read before they were published. Purchas acknowledges that he had unpublished manuscripts of Smith when he compiled his narrative. Did Smith see Strachey's manuscript before he published his Oxford tract? Or did Strachey enlarge his own notes from Smith's description? It has been usually assumed that Strachey cribbed from Smith without acknowledgement. If it were a question to be settled by the internal evidence of the two accounts, I should incline to think that Smith condensed his description from Strachey, but the dates incline the balance in Smith's favor. Strachey, in his travail, refers sometimes to Smith, and always with respect. It will be noted that Smith's map was engraved and published before the description in the Oxford tract. Purchas had it, for he says, in writing of Virginia for his pilgrimage, which was published in 1613. Concerning the latter, Virginia, Captain John Smith, partly by word of mouth, partly by his map thereof in print, and more fully by a manuscript, which he courteously communicated to me, hath acquainted me with that thereof himself with great peril and pain, had been the discoverer. Strachey, in his travail, alludes to it, and pays tribute to Smith in the following. Their several habitations are more plainly described by the annexed map, set forth by Captain Smith, of whose pains take herein I leave to the censure of the reader to judge. Sure I am there will not return from thence in haste any one who hath been more industrious, or who hath had, Captain George Percy excepted, greater experience amongst them. However, misconstruction may traduce here at home, where is not easily seen the mixed sufferances, both of body and mind, which is there daily, with no few hazards and hearty griefs undergone. There are two copies of the Strachey manuscript. The one used by the Hakluyt Society is dedicated to Sir Francis Bacon, with the title of Lord High Chancellor, and Bacon had not that title conferred on him till after 1618. But the copy among the Ashmolean manuscripts at Oxford is dedicated to Sir Allen Apsley, with the title of Purveyor to His Majesty's Navy Royal. And as Sir Allen was made Lieutenant of the Tower in 1616, it is believed that the manuscript must have been written before that date, since the author would not have omitted the more important of the two titles in his dedication. Strachey's prefatory letter to the council, prefixed to his laws, 1612, is dated, "From my lodging in the Black Friars, at your best pleasures, either to return unto the colony, or pray for the success of it here." In his letter, he speaks of his experience in the Bermudas and Virginia. The full story of both in due time I shall consecrate unto your view, howbeit since many impediments as yet must detain such my observations in the shadow of darkness, until I shall be able to deliver them perfect unto your judgment, etc. This is not, as has been assumed, a statement that the observations were not written then, only that they were not perfect. In fact, they were detained in the shadows of darkness till the year 1849. Our own inference is, from all the circumstances, that Strachey began his manuscript in Virginia, or shortly after his return, and added it and corrected it from time to time up to 1616. End of Part 1. Read by Ellen Corcoran. Part 2 of the Story of Pocahontas by Charles Dudley Warner. We are now in a position to consider Strachey's allusions to Pocahontas. The first occurs in his description of the apparel of Indian women. The better sort of women cover themselves, for the most part, all over with skin mantles, finely dressed, shagged and fringed at the skirt, carved and colored with some pretty work, or the proportion of beast, fowl, tortoises, or other such like imagery, as shall best please or express the fancy of the wearer. The younger women do not go shadowed amongst their own company until they be nigh 11 or 12 returns of the leaf old, for so they account and bring about the year, calling the fall of the leaf Tagnitok. Nor are they much ashamed thereof, and therefore would the before remembered Pocahontas, a well-featured but wanton young girl, Powhatan's daughter, sometimes resorting to our fort, of the age then of 11 or 12 years, get the boys forth with her into the marketplace, and make them wheel, falling on their hands, turning up their heels upwards, whom she would follow and wheel so herself, naked as she was, all the fort over. But being once 12 years, they put on a kind of semi-cinctum leather apron, as do our artificers, or handicraftsmen, before their bellies, and are very shamefaced to be seen bare. We have seen some use mantles made both of turkey feathers and other fowl, so prettily wrought and woven with threads, that nothing could be discerned but the feathers, which were exceedingly warm and very handsome. Strachey did not see Pocahontas. She did not resort to the camp after the departure of Smith in September 1609 until she was kidnapped by Governor Dale in April 1613. He repeats what he heard of her. The time mentioned by him of her resorting to the fort, of the age then of 11 or 12 years, must have been the time referred to by Smith when he might have married her, namely in 1608-9, when he calls her not past 13 or 14 years of age. The description of her as a young girl tumbling about the fort, naked as she was, would seem to preclude the idea that she was married at that time. The use of the word wanton is not necessarily disparaging, for wanton in that age was frequently synonymous with playful and sportive, but it is singular that she should be spoken of as well-featured but wanton. Strachey, however, gives in another place what is no doubt the real significance of the Indian name Pocahontas. He says, "Both men, women, and children have their several names, at first according to the several humor of their parents. And for the men-children, at first, when they are young, their mothers give them a name, calling them by some affectionate title, or perhaps observing their promising inclination, give it accordingly. And so the great King Powhatan called a young daughter of his, whom he loved well, Pocahontas, which may signify a little wanton. Howbeit, she was rightly called Aminata at more ripe years." The Indian girls married very young. The polygamous Powhatan had a large number of wives, but all of his women, his favorites, were a dozen, for the most part very young women, the name of whom Strachey obtained from one Kemps, an Indian a good deal about camp, whom Smith certifies was a great villain. Strachey gives a list of the names of 12 of them, at the head of which is Winanoosk. This list was no doubt written down by the author in Virginia, and it is followed by a sentence, quoted below, giving also the number of Powhatan's children. The great darling in this list was Winanoosk, a sister of Machumps, who, according to Smith, murdered his comrade in the Bermudas. Strachey writes, "He, Powhatan, was reported by the said Kemps, as also by the Indian Machumps, who is sometimes in England, and comes to and fro amongst us as he dares, and as Powhatan gives him leave, for it is not otherwise safe for him, no more than it was for one Amorous, who had his brains knocked out for selling but a basket of corn and lying in the English fort 2 or 3 days without Powhatan's leave. I say they often reported unto us that Powhatan had then living 20 sons and 10 daughters, beside a young one by Winanoosk, Machumps, his sister, and a great darling of the king's, and besides, young Pocahontas, a daughter of his, using some time to our fort in times past, now married to a private captain called Coquocum, some 2 years since. This passage is a great puzzle. Does Strachey intend to say that Pocahontas was married to an Indian named Coquocum? She might have been during the time after Smith's departure in 1609 and her kidnapping in 1613, when she was of marriageable age. We shall see hereafter that Powhatan in 1614 said he had sold another favorite daughter of his, whom Sir Thomas Dale desired, and who was not 12 years of age, to be wife to a great chief. The term private captain might perhaps be applied to the Indian chief. Smith, in his General History, says the Indians have but few occasions to use any officers more than one commander, which commonly they call Werawan or Kakoraus, which is captain. It is probably not possible, with the best intentions, to twist Kakoam into Kakoraus, or to suppose that Strachey intended to say that a private captain was called in Indian a Kokuum. Werawan and Kakoraus are not synonymous terms. Werawan means chief, and Kakoras means talker or orator, and is the original of our word caucus. Either Strachey was uninformed, or Pocahontas was married to an Indian, a not violent presumption considering her age and the fact that war between Powhatan and the whites for some time had cut off intercourse between them, or Strachey referred to her marriage with Rolfe, whom he calls by mistake Coquocum. If this is to be accepted, then this paragraph must have been written in England in 1616 and have referred to the marriage to Rolfe, it's some 2 years since 1614. That Pocahontas was a gentle-hearted and pleasing girl, and through her acquaintance with Smith, friendly to the whites, there is no doubt that she was not different in her habits and mode of life from other Indian girls. Before the time of her kidnapping, there is every reason to suppose it was the English who magnified the imperialism of her father and exaggerated her own station as princess. She certainly put on no airs of royalty when she was cartwheeling about the fort, nor does this detract anything from the native dignity of the mature and converted and partially civilized women. We should expect there would be the discrepancies which have been noticed in the estimates of her age. Powhatan is not said to have kept a private secretary to register births in his family. If Pocahontas gave her age correctly, as it appears upon her London portrait in 1616, aged 21, she must have been 18 years of age when she was captured in 1613. This would make her about 12 at the time of Smith's captivity in 1607-8. There is certainly room for difference of opinion as to whether so precocious a woman, as her intelligent apprehension of affairs shows her to have been, should have remained unmarried till the age of 18. In marrying at least as early as that, she would have followed the custom of her tribe. It is possible that her intercourse with the whites had raised her above such an alliance as would be offered her at the court of Werowocomoco. We are without any record of the life of Pocahontas for some years. The occasional mentions of her name in the General History are so evidently interpolated at a late date that they do not aid us. When and where she took the name Matoaka, which appears upon her London portrait, we are not told, nor when she was called Amonada, as Strachey says she was at more ripe years. How she was occupied from the departure of Smith to her abduction, we can only guess. To follow her authentic history, we must take up the account of Captain Argall and of Ralph Hamar, Jr., Secretary of the colony under Governor Dale. Captain Argall, who seemed to have been as bold as he was unscrupulous in the execution of any plan entrusted to him, arrived in Virginia in September 1612, and early in the spring of 1613, he was sent on an expedition up the Pottawattamie to trade for corn and to effect a capture that would bring Powhatan to terms. The emperor, from being a friend, had to become the most implacable enemy of the English. Captain Argall says, "I was told by certain Indians, my friends, that the great Powhatan's daughter, Pocahontas, was with the great king Pottawattamie, whither I presently repaired, resolved to possess myself of her by any stratagem that I could use, for the ransoming of so many Englishmen as were prisoners with Powhatan, as also to get such arms and tools as he and other Indians had got by murder and stealing some others of our nation, with some quantity of corn for the colony's relief." By the aid of Japazeus, king of Pastency, an old acquaintance and friend of Argall's, and the connivance of the king of Pottawattamie, Pocahontas was enticed on board Argall's ship and secured. Word was sent to Powhatan of the capture and the terms on which his daughter would be released, namely, the return of the white men he held in slavery, the tools and arms he had gotten and stolen, and a great quantity of corn. Powhatan, much grieved, replied that if Argall would use his daughter well and bring the ship to his river and release her, he would accede to all his demands. Therefore, on the 13th of April, Argall repaired to Governor Gates at Jamestown and delivered his prisoner, and a few days after, the king sent home some of the white captives, 3 pieces, 1 broadaxe, a long whipsaw, and a canoe of corn. Pocahontas, however, was kept at Jamestown. Why Pocahontas had left Werowocomoco and gone to stay with Pottawattamie, we can only conjecture. It is possible that Powhatan suspected her friendliness to the whites and was wary of her importunity, and it may be that she wanted to escape the sight of continual fighting, ambushes, and murders. More likely, she was only making a common friendly visit, though Hammer says she went to trade at an Indian fair. The story of her capture is enlarged and more minutely related by Ralph Hammer, Jr., who was one of the colony shipwrecked on the Bermudas in 1609 and returned to England in 1614, where he published, London, 1615, A True Discourse of Virginia and the Success of the Affairs There till the 18th of June, 1614. Hammer was the son of a merchant tailor in London who was a member of the Virginia Company. Hammer writes, "It chanced Powhatan's delight in darling, his daughter Pocahontas, whose fame has even been spread in England by the title of Nonparella of Virginia, in her princely progress, if I may so term it, took some pleasure, in the absence of Captain Argall, to be among her friends at Pottawattamie, as it seemeth by the relation I had, implored thither as shopkeeper to a fair, to exchange some of her father's commodities for theirs, where residing some 3 months or longer, it fortuned upon occasion either of promise or profit, Captain Argall to arrive there, whom Pocahontas, desirous to renew her familiarity with the English, and delighting to see them as unknown, fearful perhaps to be surprised, would gladly visit as she did, of whom no sooner had Captain Argall intelligence. But he dealt with an old friend, Iapezus, how and by what means he might procure her caption, assuring him that now or never was the time to pleasure him. if he intended indeed that love which he had made profession of, that in ransom of her he might redeem some of our English men and arms, now in the possession of her father, promising to use her with all fair and gentle entreaty. Iapezus, well assured that his brother, as he promised, would use her courteously, promised his best endeavors and service to accomplish his desire, and thus wrought it, making his wife an instrument, which sex have ever been most powerful in beguiling enticements. To effect his plot, which he had thus laid, he agreed that himself, his wife, and Pocahontas would accompany his brother to the waterside, whither come, his wife should feign a great and longing desire to go aboard and see the ship, which being there 3 or 4 times before she had never seen, and should be earnest with her husband to permit. He seemed angry with her, making, as he pretended, so unnecessary request, especially being without the company of women, which denial she taking unkindly, must feign to weep, as who knows not that women can command tears, whereupon her husband, seeming to pity those counterfeit tears, gave her leave to go aboard, so that it would please Pocahontas to accompany her. Now was the greatest labor to win her, guilty perhaps of her father's wrongs, though not known as she supposed, to go with her, yet by her earnest persuasions she assented. So forthwith aboard they went. The best cheer that could be made was seasonably provided. To supper they went, merry on all hands, especially Iapezus and his wife, who to express their joy would ere be treading upon Captain Argyll's foot, as who should say 'tis done, she is your own. Supper ended. Pocahontas was lodged in the gunner's room, but Iapezus and his wife desired to have some conference with their brother, which was only to acquaint him by what stratagem they had betrayed his prisoner, as I have already related. After which discourse to sleep they went, Pocahontas nothing mistrusting this policy, who nevertheless, being most possessed with fear and desire of return, was first up and hastened Iapezus to be gone. Captain Argyll, having secretly well rewarded him with a small copper kittle and some other less valuable toys so highly by him esteemed, that doubtless he would have betrayed his own father for them, permitted both of them and his wife to return, but told him that for divers considerations, as for that his father had then 8 of our Englishmen, many swords, pieces, and other tools, which he hid at several times by treacherous murdering of our men, taken from them which though of no use to him, he would not redeliver. He would reserve Pocahontas, whereat she began to be exceeding pensive and discontented, yet ignorant of the dealing of Iapezus, who in outward appearance was no less discontented that he should be the means of her captivity. Much ado there was to persuade her to be patient, which, with extraordinary courteous usage, by little and little was wrought in her, and so to Jamestown she was brought. Smith, who concedes this account in his General History, expresses that his contempt with this Indian treachery by saying, "The old Jew and his wife began to howl and cry as fast as Pocahontas." It will be noted that the account of their visit, apparently alone, of Pocahontas and her capture, is strong evidence that she was not at this time married to Coquocum or anybody else. Word was dispatched to Powhatan of his daughter's duress, with a demand made for the restitution of goods. But although this savage is represented as dearly loving Pocahontas, his delight and darling, it was, according to Hammer, 3 months before they heard anything from him. His anxiety about his daughter could not have been intense. He retained a part of his plunder, and a message was sent to him that Pocahontas would be kept till he restored all the arms. This answer pleased Powhatan so little that they heard nothing from him till the following March. Then Sir Thomas Dale and Captain Argyle, with several vessels and 150 men, went up to Powhatan's chief seat, taking his daughter with them, offering the Indians a chance to fight for her, or to take her in peace on surrender of the stolen goods. The Indians received with this bravado and flights of arrows, reminding them of the fate of Captain Ratcliffe. The whites landed, killed some Indians, burnt 40 houses, pillaged the village, and went up the river and came to anchor in front of Matchcot, the emperor's chief town. Here were assembled 400 armed men with bows and arrows, who dared them to come ashore. Ashore they went, and a palaver was held. The Indians wanted a day to consult their king, after which they would fight, if nothing but blood would satisfy the whites. End of Part 2. Read by Ellen Corcoran. Part 3 of The Story of Pocahontas by Charles Dudley Warner. Two of Powhatan's sons who were present expressed a desire to see their sister, who had been taken on shore. When they had sight of her and saw how well she was cared for, they greatly rejoiced and promised to persuade their father to redeem her and conclude a lasting peace. The two brothers were taken on board ship, and Master John Rolfe and Master Sparks were sent to negotiate with the king. Powhatan did not show himself, but his brother Apachamo, his successor, promised to use his best efforts to bring about a peace, and the expedition returned to Jamestown. Long before this time, Hammer relates, a gentleman of approved behavior and honest carriage, Master John Rolfe, had been in love with Pocahontas, and she with him, which thing at the instant that we were in parley with them, myself made known to Sir Thomas Dale by a letter from him, Rolfe, whereby he entreated his advice and furtherance to his love, if so it seemed fit to him for the good of the plantation, and Pocahontas herself acquainted her brethren therewith. Governor Dale approved this, and consequently was willing to retire without other conditions. The bruit of this pretended marriage, Hammer continues, came soon to Powhatan's knowledge, a thing acceptable to him, as appeared by his sudden consent thereunto, whom some 10 days after sent an old uncle of hers, named Opashisco, to give her as his deputy in the church, and 2 of his sons to see the marriage solemnized, which was accordingly done about the 5th of April, 1614, and ever since we have had friendly commerce and trade, not only with Powhatan himself, but also with his subjects round about us. So as now I see no reason why the colony should not thrive apace. This marriage was justly celebrated as the means and beginning of a firm peace which long continued, so that Pocahontas was again entitled to the grateful remembrance of the Virginia settlers. Already, in 1612, a plan had been mooted in Virginia of marrying the English with the natives, and of obtaining the recognition of Powhatan and those allied to him as members of a 5th kingdom, with certain privileges. Cunega, the Spanish ambassador at London, on September 22, 1612, writes, although some suppose the plantation to decrease, he is credibly informed that there is a determination to marry some of the people that go over to Virginia. 40 or 50 are already so married, and English women intermingle and are received kindly by the natives. A zealous minister hath been wounded for reprehending it. Mr. John Rolfe was a man of industry, and apparently devoted to the welfare of the colony. He probably brought with him in 1610 his wife, who gave birth to his daughter Bermuda, born on the Somers Islands at the time of the shipwreck. We find no notice of her death. Hammer gives him the distinction of being the first in the colony to try, in 1612, the planting and raising of tobacco. No man, he adds, hath labored to his power, by good example there, and worthy encouragement into England by his letters, than he hath done. Witness his marriage with Powhatan's daughter, one of rude education, manners barbarous, and cursed generation, merely for the good and honor of the plantation. And lest any man should conceive that some sinister respects allured him hereunto, I have made bold, contrary to his knowledge, in the end of my treatise, to insert the true copy of his letter written to Sir Thomas Dale. The letter is long, labored, and curious document, and comes nearer to a theological treatise than any love letter we have on record. It reeks with unction. Why Rolfe did not speak to Dale, whom he saw every day, instead of inflicting upon him this painful document, in which the flutterings of a too susceptible widower's heart are hidden under a great resolve of self-sacrifice, is not plain. The letter protests in a tedious preamble that the writer is moved entirely by the Spirit of God, and continues, Let therefore this my well-advised protestation, which here I make between God and my own conscience, be a sufficient witness at the dreadful day of judgment, when the secrets of all men's hearts shall be opened, to condemn me herein, if my chiefest interest and purpose be not to strive with all my power of body and mind, in the undertaking of so weighty a matter, no way led, so far forth as man's weakness may permit, with the unbridled desire of carnal affection, but for the good of this plantation, for the honor of our country, for the glory of God, for my own salvation, and for the converting to the true knowledge of God and Jesus Christ, an unbelieving creature, namely Pocahontas, to whom my hearty and best thoughts are, and have a long time been so entangled, and enthralled in so intricate a labyrinth, that I was even awearied to unwind myself thereout. Master Rolfe goes on to describe the mighty war in his meditations on this subject, in which he had set before his eyes the frailty of mankind, and his proneness to evil and wicked thoughts. He is aware of God's displeasure against the sons of Levi and Israel for marrying strange wives, and this has caused him to look about warily and with good circumspection into the grounds and principal agitations which should thus provoke me to be in love with one whose education hath been rude, her manners barbarous, her generation accursed, and so discrepant in all nutriture from myself, that oftentimes with fear and trembling I have ended my private controversy with this. Surely these are wicked instigations, fetched by him who seeketh and delighteth in man's destruction. And so with fervent prayer to be ever present from such diabolical assaults, as I look those to be, I have taken some rest. The good man was desperately in love and wanted to marry the Indian, and consequently he got no peace, and still being tormented with her image, whether she was absent or present, he set out to produce an ingenious reason to show the world for marrying her. He continues, Thus, when I thought I had obtained my peace and quietness, behold another, but more gracious tentation hath made breaches into my holiest and strongest meditations, with which I have been put to a new trial in a straighter manner than the former. For besides the weary passions and sufferings which I have daily, hourly, yea, and in my sleep endured, even awaking me to astonishment, taxing me with remissness and carelessness, refusing and neglecting to perform the duty of a good Christian, pulling me by the ear and crying, Why dost thou not endeavor to make her a Christian? And these have happened to my greater wonder, even when she hath been furthest separated from me, which in common reason, were it not an undoubted work of God, might breed forgetfulness of a far more worthy creature. He accurately describes the symptoms and appears to understand the remedy, but he is after a large-sized motive. Besides, I say the Holy Spirit of God hath often demanded of me why I was created, if not for transitory pleasures and worldly vanities, but to labor in the Lord's vineyard, there to sow and plant, to nourish and increase the fruits thereof, daily adding with the good husband in the gospel, somewhat to the talent that in the ends the fruits may be reaped, to the comfort of the labor of his life and his salvation in the world to come. Likewise, adding hereunto her great appearance of love to me, her desire to be taught and instructed in the knowledge of God, her capableness of understanding, her aptness and willingness to receive any good impression, and also the spiritual, besides her own incitements, stirring me up hereunto. The incitements gave him courage so that he exclaims, "Shall I be so untoward a disposition as to refuse to lead the blind into the right way? Shall I be so unnatural as not to give bread to the hungry, or uncharitable as not to cover the naked?" It was thought to be thought of such wickedness, and so Master Rolfe screwed up his courage to marry the glorious princess, from whom thousands of people were afterwards so anxious to be descended. But he made the sacrifice for the glory of the country, the benefit of the plantation, and the conversion of the unregenerate, and other and lower motive he vigorously repels. Now, if the vulgar sort, who square all men's actions by the base rule of their own filthiness, shall tax or taunt me in this my godly labor, let them know it is not hungry appetite to gorge myself with incontinency. Sure, if I would and were so sensually inclined, I might satisfy such desire, though not without a seared conscience, yet with Christians more pleasing to the eye, and less fearful in the offense unlawfully committed. Nor am I in so desperate an estate that I regard not what becometh of me, nor am I out of hope but one day to see my country, nor so void of friends, nor mean in birth, but there to obtain a mock, to my great content. But shall it please God thus to dispose of me, which I earnestly desire to fulfill my ends before set down, I will heartily accept of it as a godly tax appointed me, and I will never cease, God assisting me, until I have accomplished and brought to perfection so holy a work, in which I will daily pray God to bless me, to mine and her eternal happiness. It is to be hoped that if sanctimonious John wrote any love letters to Aminata, they had less cant in them than this. But it was pleasing to Sir Thomas Dale, who was a man to appreciate the high motives of Mr. Rolfe. In a letter which he dispatched from Jamestown, June 18, 1614, to a reverend friend in London, he describes the expedition when Pocahontas was carried up the river, and adds the information that when she went on shore, she would not talk to any of them, scarcely to them of the best sort, and to them only, that if her father had loved her, he would not value her less than old swords, pieces, or axes. Wherefore she would still dwell with the Englishmen who loved her. Powhatan's daughter, the letter continues, I caused to be carefully instructed in Christian religion, who after she had made some good progress therein, renounced publicly her country idolatry, openly confessed her Christian faith, was, as she desired, baptized, and is since married to an English gentleman of good understanding, as by his letter unto me, containing the reasons for his marriage of her you may perceive, and other not to bind this peace the stronger. Her father and friends gave approbation to it, and her uncle gave her to him in the church. She lives civilly and lovingly with him, and I trust will increase in goodness, as the knowledge of God increaseth in her. She will go into England with me, and were it but the gaining of this one soul, I will think my time, toil, and present stay well spent. Hammer, who also appends his narration with a short letter of the same date with the above, from the minister Alexander Whitaker, the genuineness of which is questioned. In speaking of the good deeds of Sir Thomas Dale, it says, "But that which is best, one Pocahontas, or Matoa, the daughter of Powhatan, is married to an honest and discreet English gentleman, Master Rolfe, and that after she had openly renounced her country idolatry and confessed the faith of Jesus Christ, and was baptized, which thing Sir Thomas Dale had labored a long time to ground her in. If, as this proclaims, she was married after her conversion, then Rolfe's tender conscience must have given him another twist for wedding her, when the reason for marrying her, her conversion, had ceased with her baptism. His marriage, according to this, was a pure work of supererogation. It took place about the 5th of April, 1614. It is not known who performed the ceremony. How Pocahontas passed her time in Jamestown during the period of her detention, we are not told. Conjectures are made that she was an inmate of the house of Sir Thomas Dale or of that of Reverend Mr. Whitaker, both of whom labored zealously to enlighten her mind on religious subjects. She must have also been learning English and civilized ways, for it is sure that she spoke our language very well when she went to London. Mr. John Rolfe was also laboring for her conversion, and we may suppose that with all these ministrations, mingled with her love of Mr. Rolfe, which that ingenious widower had discovered, and her desire to convert him into a husband, she was not an unwilling captive. Whatever may have been her barbarous instincts, we have the testimony of Governor Dale that she lived civilly and lovingly with her husband. End of Part 3. Read by Ellen Corcoran. Part 4 of The Story of Pocahontas. The Story of Pocahontas by Charles Dudley Warner. Sir Thomas Dale was on the whole the most efficient and discreet governor the colony had had. One element of his success was no doubt the change in the charter of 1609. By the first charter, everything had been held in common by the company, and there had been no division of property or allotment of land among the colonists. Under the new regime, land was held in severalty, and the spur of individual interest began at once to improve the condition of the settlement. The character of the colonists was also gradually improving. They had not been of a sort to fulfill the earnest desire of the London promoters to spread vital piety in the New World. A zealous defense of Virginia and Maryland against scandalous imputation entitled Leigh and Rachel, or The Two Fruitful Sisters, by Mr. John Hammond, London, 1656, considers the charges that Virginia is an unhealthy place, a nest of rogues, abandoned women, dissolute and rookery persons, a place of intolerable labor, bad usage, and hard diet, and admits that, at the first settling, and for many years after, it deserved most of these aspersions, nor were they then aspersions but truths. There were jails supplied, youth seduced, infamous women drilled in, the provision all bought out of England, and that embezzled by the trustees. Governor Dale was a soldier. Entering the army in the Netherlands as a private, he had risen to high position and received knighthood in 1606. Shortly after, he was with Sir Thomas Gates in South Holland. The States General in 1611 granted him 3 years' term of absence in Virginia. Upon his arrival, he began to put in force that system of industry and frugality he had observed in Holland. He had all the imperiousness of a soldier, and in an altercation with Captain Newport, occasioned by some injurious remarks the latter made by Sir Thomas Smith, the treasurer, he pulled his beard and threatened to hang him. Active operations for settling new plantations were at once begun, and Dale wrote to Cecil, the Earl of Salisbury, for 2,000 good colonists to be sent out, for the 300 that came were so profane, so riotous, so full of mutiny, that not many are Christians but in name, their bodies so diseased and crazed that not 60 of them may be employed. He served afterwards with credit in Holland, was made commander of the East Indian Fleet in 1618, had a naval engagement with the Dutch near Bantman in 1619, and died in 1620 from the effects of the climate. He was twice married, and his second wife, Lady Fanny, the cousin of his first wife, survived him and received a patent for a Virginia plantation. Governor Dale kept steadily in view the conversion of the Indians to Christianity, and the success of John Rolfe with Matoaka inspired him with a desire to convert another daughter of Powhatan, of whose exquisite perfections he had heard. He therefore dispatched Ralph Hammer with the English boy, Tom Savage, as interpreter on a mission to the court of Powhatan, upon a message unto him which was to deal with him, if by any means I might procure a daughter of his, who, Pocahontas being already in our possession, is generally reported to be his delight and darling, and surely he esteemed her as his own soul, for a sure pledge of peace. This visit Hammer relates with great naivete. At his town of Matchcott, near the head of York River, Powhatan himself received his visitors when they landed, with great cordiality, expressing much pleasure at seeing again the boy who had been presented to him by Captain Newport, and whom he had not seen since he gave him leave to go and see his friends at Jamestown 4 years before. He also inquired anxiously after Namantak, who he had sent to King James Land to see him and his country and report thereon, and then led the way to his house, where he sat down on his bedstead side. On each hand of him was placed a comely and personable young woman, which he called his queens, the house within round about beset with them, the outside guarded with 100 bowmen. The first thing offered was a pipe of tobacco, which Powhatan first drank and then passed to Hammer, who drank what he pleased and then returned it. The emperor then inquired how his brother Sir Thomas Dale fared, and after that of his daughter's welfare, her marriage, his unknown son, and how they liked, lived, and loved together. Hammer replied that his brother was very well, and his daughter was so well content that she could not change her life to return and live with him, whereat he laughed heartily, and said he was very glad of it. Powhatan then desired to know the cause of his unexpected coming, and Mr. Hammer said his message was private, to be delivered to him without the presence of any except one of his counselors and one of the guides, who already knew it. Therefore, the house was cleared of all except the 2 queens, who may never sequester themselves, and Mr. Hammer began his palaver. First there was a message of love and inviolable peace, the production of presents of coffee, beads, combs, fishhooks, and knives, and the promise of a grindstone when it pleased the emperor to send for it. Hammer then proceeded. The bruit of the exquisite perfection of your youngest daughter, being famous through all your territories, hath come to the hearing of your brother, Sir Thomas Dale, who for this purpose hath addressed me hither, to entreat you by that brotherly friendship you make profession of, to permit her, with me, to return unto him, partly for the desire which himself hath, and partly for the desire her sister hath, to see her, of whom, if fame hath not been prodigal, as like enough it hath not, your brother, by your favor, would gladly make his nearest companion, wife, and bedfellow. Many times he would have interrupted my speech, which I entreated him to hear out, and then, if he pleased, to return me answer. And the reason hereof is, because being now friendly and firmly united together, and made one people, as he supposeth and believes, in the bond of love, he would make a natural union between us, principally because himself hath taken resolution to dwell in your country so long as he liveth, and would not only therefore have the firmest assurance he may of perpetual friendship from you, but also hereby bind himself thereunto. Powhatan replied with dignity that he gladly accepted the salute of love and peace, which he and his subjects would exactly maintain. But as to the other matter, he said, My daughter, whom my brother desireth, I sold within these 3 days to be wife to a great werowance for 2 bushels of roanoke, a small kind of beads made of oyster shells. And it is true she is already gone with him 3 days' journey from me. Hammer persisted that this marriage need not stand in the way, that if it pleased herein to gratify his brother, he might, restoring the roanoke without the imputation of injustice, take home his daughter again, the rather because she was not full 12 years old, and therefore not marriageable. Assuring him beside the bond of peace, so much the firmer, he should have trebled the price of his daughter in beads, copper, hatchets, and many other things more useful for him. The reply of the noble old savage to this infamous demand ought to have brought a blush to the cheeks of those who made it. He said he loved his daughter as dearly as his life. He had many children, but he delighted in none so much as her. He could not live if he did not see her often, as he would not if she were living with the whites, and he was determined not to put himself in their hands. He desired no other assurance of friendship than his brother had given him, who had already one of his daughters, as a pledge, which was sufficient while she lived. When she dieth, he shall have another child of mine. And then he broke forth in pathetic eloquence. I hold it not a brotherly part of your king to desire to bereave me of 2 of my children at once. Further, give him to understand that if he had no pledge at all, he should not need to distrust any injury from me, or any under my subjection. There have been too many of his and my men killed, and by my occasion there shall never be more. I which have power to perform it have said it. No, not though I should have just occasion offered, for I am now old, and would gladly end my days in peace. So as if the English offer me any injury, my country is large enough. I will remove myself farther from you. The old man hospitably entertained his guest for a day or 2, loaded them with presents, among which were 2 dressed buckskins, white as snow, for his son and daughter, and, requesting some articles sent him in return, bade them farewell with this message to Governor Dale. I hope this will give him good satisfaction. If it do not, I will go 3 days' journey farther from him, and never see Englishmen more. It speaks well for the temperate habits of this savage that after he had feasted his guests, he caused to be fetched a great glass of sack, some 3 quarts or better, which Captain Newport had given him 6 or 7 years since, carefully preserved by him, not much above a pint in all this time spent, and gave each of us in a great oyster shell some 3 spoonfuls. We trust that Sir Thomas Dale, gave a faithful account of all this to his wife in England. Sir Thomas Gates left Virginia in the spring of 1614 and never returned. After his departure, scarcity and severity developed a mutiny, and 6 of the settlers were executed. Rolfe was planting tobacco. He has the credit of being the first white planter of it, and his wife was getting an inside view of Christian civilization. In 1616, Sir Thomas Dale returned to England with his company, and John Rolfe and Pocahontas and several other Indians. They reached Plymouth early in June, and on the 20th, Lord Carew made this note: Sir Thomas Dale returned from Virginia. He hath brought divers men and women of that country to be educated here, and one Rolfe who married a daughter of Powhatan, the barbarous prince, called Pocahontas, hath brought his wife with him into England. On the 22nd, Sir John Chamberlain wrote to Sir Dudley Carleton that there were 10 or 12 old and young of that country. The Indian girls who came with Pocahontas appear to have been a great care to the London Company. In May 1620 is a record that the company had to pay for physic and cordials for one of them who had been living as a servant in Cheapside and was very weak of a consumption. The same year, 2 other of the maids were shipped off to the Bermudas after being long a charge to the company, in the hope that they might there get husbands, that after they were converted and had children, they might be sent to their country and kindred to civilize them. One of them was there married. The attempt to educate them in England was not very successful, and a proposal to bring over Indian boys obtained this comment from Sir Edwin Sandys: Now to send for them into England, and to have them educated here, he found upon experience of those bought by Sir Thomas Dale, might be far from the Christian work intended. One Nanomac, a lad bought over by Lord Delaware, lived some years in houses where he heard not much of religion, but sins, had many times examples of drinking, swearing, and like evils, ran as he were a mere pagan, till he fell in with a devout family and changed his life, but died before he was baptized. Accompanying Pocahontas was a counselor of Powhatan, one Tomocomo, the husband of one of her sisters, of whom Purchas says in his Pilgrims, With this savage I have often conversed with this good friend Master Dr. Goldstone, where he was a frequent guest, and where I have seen him sing and dance his diabolical measures, and heard him discourse of his country and religion. Master Rolfe lent me a discourse, which I have in my pilgrimage delivered. And his wife did not only accustom herself to civility, but still carried herself as the daughter of a king, and was accordingly respected, not only by the company, which allowed provision for herself and her son, but of divers particular persons of honor, in their hopeful zeal by her to advance Christianity. I was present when my honorable and reverend patron, the Lord Bishop of London, Dr. King, entertained her with festival stamp and pomp beyond what I had seen in his great hospitality offered to other ladies. At her return towards Virginia, she came at Gravesend to her end and grave, having given great demonstration of her Christian sincerity, as the first fruits of Virginia conversion, leaving here a good memory and the hopes of her resurrection, her soul aspiring to see and enjoy permanently in heaven what here she had joyed and hear and believe of her blessed Savior. Not such was Tomocomo, but a blasphemer of what he knew not, and preferring his God to ours, because he taught them, by his own so appearing, to wear their devil-lock at the left ear. He acquainted me with the manner of that his appearance, and believed that their oki or devil had taught them their husbandry. End of Part 4. Read by Ellen Corcoran. Part 5 of The Story of Pocahontas by Charles Dudley Warner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 5. Upon news of her arrival, Captain Smith, either to increase his own importance or because Pocahontas was neglected, addressed a letter or little book to Queen Anne, the consort of King James. This letter is found in Smith's General History, 1624, where it is introduced as having been sent to Queen Anne in 1616. Probably he sent her such a letter. We find no mention of its receipt or any acknowledgement of it. Whether the abstract in the General History is exactly like the original, we have no means of knowing. We have no more confidence in Smith's memory than we have in his dates. The letter is as follows. To the most high and virtuous Princess Queen Anne of Great Britain, most admired Queen, the love I bear my God, my King and country, hath so oft emboldened me in the worst of extreme dangers, that now honesty doth constrain me presume thus far beyond myself to present your majesty this short discourse. If ingratitude be a deadly poison to all honest virtues, I must be guilty of that crime if I should omit any means to be thankful. So it is, that some 10 years ago, being in Virginia, and taken prisoner by the power of Powhatan, their chief king, I received from this great savage exceeding great courtesy, especially from his son, Nantaquas, the most manliest, comeliest, boldest spirit I ever saw in a savage, and his sister Pocahontas, the king's most dear and well-beloved daughter, being but a child of 12 or 13 years of age, whose compassionate, pitiful heart of desperate estate gave me much cause to respect her. I, being the first Christian this proud king and his grim attendants ever saw, and thus enthralled in their barbarous power, I cannot say I felt the least occasion of want that was in the power of those my mortal foes to prevent notwithstanding all their threats. After some 6 weeks fatting amongst those savage courtiers, at the minute of my execution, she hazarded the beating out of her own brains to save mine. And not only that, but so prevailed with her father that I was safely conducted to Jamestown, where I found about 38 miserable, poor, and sick creatures to keep possession of all those large territories in Virginia. Such was the weakness of this poor commonwealth, as had the savages not fed us, we directly had starved. And this relief, most gracious Queen, was commonly brought us by this Lady Pocahontas, notwithstanding all these passages when inconstant fortune turned our peace to war. This tender virgin would still not spare to dare to visit us, and by her our jars have been oft appeased, and our wants still supplied. Were it the policy of her father thus to employ her, or the ordinance of God thus to make her his instrument, or her extraordinary affection to our nation, I know not. But of this I am sure. When her father, with the utmost of his policy and power, sought to surprise me, having but 18 with me, the dark night could not affright her from coming through the irksome woods, and with watered eyes gave me intelligence, with her best advice to escape his fury, which had he known, he had surely slain her. Jamestown with her wild train she as freely frequented as her father's habitation, and during the time of 2 or 3 years, she next, under God, was still the instrument to preserve this colony from death, famine, and utter confusion, which, if in those times had once been dissolved, Virginia might have lain as it was at our first arrival to this day. Since then, this business having been turned and varied by many accidents from that I left it at, It is most certain, after a long and troublesome war after my departure, betwixt her father and our colony, all which time she was not heard of, about 2 years longer, the colony by that means was relieved, peace concluded, and at last rejecting her barbarous condition, was married to an English gentleman, with whom at his present she is in England. The first Christian ever of that nation, the first Virginian ever spake English, or had a child in marriage by an Englishman, a matter surely, if my meaning be truly considered and well understood, worthy a prince's understanding. Thus, most gracious lady, I have related to your majestic what at your best leisure our approved histories will account you at large and done in the time of your majestic life, and however this might be presented you from a more worthy pen, it cannot be from a more honest heart. As yet I never begged anything of the state, or any, and it is my want of ability and her exceeding desert, your birth, means, and authority, her birth, virtue, want, and simplicity, doth make me thus bold, humbly to beseech your majestic, to take this knowledge of her, though it be from one so unworthy to be the reporter as myself, her husband's estate not being able to make her fit to attend your majestic. The most and least I can do is to tell you this, because none so oft hath tried it myself, and the rather being of so great a spirit, however her station, if she should not be well received, seeing this kingdom may rightly have a kingdom by her means. Her present love to us and Christianity might turn to such scorn and fury as to divert all this good to the worst of evil, when finding so great a queen should do her some honor more than she can imagine, for being so kind to your servants and subjects, would so ravish her with content as endear her dearest blood, to effect that your majestic and all the king's honest subjects most earnestly desire, and so I humbly kiss your gracious hand. The passage in this letter, she hazarded the beating out of her own brains to save mine, is inconsistent with the preceding portion of the paragraph, which speaks of the exceeding great courtesy of Powhatan, and Smith was quite capable of inserting it afterwards when he made up his general history. Smith represents himself at this time, the last half of 1616 and the first 3 months of 1617, as preparing to attempt a third voyage to New England, which he did not make, and too busy to do Pocahontas the service she desired. She was staying at Brantford, either from neglect of the company or because the London smoke disagreed with her, and there Smith went to see her. His account of his intercourse with her, the only one we have, must be given for what it is worth. According to this, she had supposed Smith dead, and took umbrage of his neglect of her. He writes, "After a modest salutation, without any word, she turned about, obscured her face, as not seeming well contented. And in that humor, her husband with divers others, we all left her 2 or 3 hours, repenting myself to have writ she could speak English. But not long after she began to talk, remembering me well with courtesies she had done, saying, 'You did promise Powhatan what was yours should be his, and he the like to you. You called him father, being in his land a stranger, and by the same reason so must I do. Which though I would have excused, I durst not aloud of that title, because she was a king's daughter.' With a well-set countenance, she said, 'Were you not afraid to come into my father's country and cause fear in him, and all his people, but me, and fear you have I should call your father? I tell you then I will, and you shall call me child, and so I will be forever and ever your countryman.' They did tell me always you were dead, and I knew no other till I came to Plymouth. Yet Powhatan did command Utamautomakin to seek you, and know the truth, because your countrymen will lie much. This savage was the Tomokumo spoken of above, who had been sent by Powhatan to take a census of the people of England and report what they and their state were. At Plymouth, he got a long stick and began to make notches in it for the people he saw, but he was quickly weary of that task. He told Smith that Powhatan bade him seek him out and get him to show him his God, and the king, queen, and prince of whom Smith had told so much. Smith put him off about showing his God, but said he had heard that he had seen the king. This the Indian denied, James probably not coming up to his idea of a king till by circumstance he was convinced he had seen him. Then he replied very sadly, "You gave Powhatan a white dog, which Powhatan fed as himself, but your king gave me nothing, and I am better than your white dog." Smith adds that he took several courtiers to see Pocahontas, and they did think God had a great hand in their conversation, and they have seen many English ladies worse favored, proportioned, and behaviored. And he heard that it had pleased the king and queen greatly to esteem her, as also Lord and Lady Delaware, and other persons of good quality, both at the masques and otherwise. Much has been said about the reception of Pocahontas in London, but the contemporary notice of her are scant. The Indians were objects of curiosity for a time in London, as odd Americans have often been since, and the rank of Pocahontas procured her special attention. She was presented at court. She was entered by Dr. King, Bishop of London. At the playing of Ben Jonson's Christmas His Mask at court, January 6, 1616 to 1617, Pocahontas and Tomokomo were both present, and Chamberlain writes to Carleton, "The Virginian woman Pocahontas, with her father counselor, have been with the king and graciously used, and both she and her assistant were pleased at the masque. She is upon her return, though sore against her will, if the wind would about to send her away." Mr. Neal says that after the first weeks of her residence in England, she does not appear to be spoken of as the wife of Rolfe by the letter writers, and the Reverend Peter Fontaine says that when they heard that Rolfe had married Pocahontas, it was deliberated in council whether he had not committed high treason by doing so, that is, marrying an Indian princess. It was like James to think so. His interest in the colony was never the most intelligent, and apt to be in things trivial. Lord Southampton, December 15, 1609, writes to Lord Salisbury that he had told the king of the Virginia squirrels brought into England, which are said to fly. The king very earnestly asked if none were provided for him, and said he was sure Salisbury would get him one. Would not have troubled him, but that you know so well how he is affected to these toys. There has been recently found in the British Museum a print of a portrait of Pocahontas with a legend round it in Latin, which is translated Matoaka, alias Rebecca, daughter of Prince Powhatan, Emperor of Virginia, converted to Christianity, married Mr. Rolfe, died on shipboard at Gravesend, 1617. This is doubtless the portrait engraved by Simon de Passé in 1616, and now inserted in the extant copies of the London edition of the General History, 1624. It is not probable that the portrait was originally published with the General History. The portrait inserted in the edition of 1624 has this inscription: "Round the portrait, Matoaka, also known as Rebecca Filia Potentis Princeps, Chief Powhatan, Virginia. In the oval under the portrait, at the age of 21, 1616, Matawaka, also Rebecca, daughter of the mighty Prince Powhatan, Emperor of Atanaukamuk, also Virginia, converted and baptized in the Christian faith, and wife to the worthy Mr. John Rolfe, I. Passius Sculpsist, Compton, Holland, excluded. Camden, in his History of Gravesend, says that everybody paid his young lady all the imaginable respect, and it was believed she would have sufficiently acknowledged those favors had she lived to return to her own country by bringing the Indians to a kinder disposition toward the English, and that she died, giving testimony all the time she lay sick of her being a very good Christian. The Lady Rebecca, as she was called in London, died on shipboard at Gravesend after a brief illness, said to be of only 3 days, probably on the 21st of March, 1617. I have seen somewhere a statement, which I cannot confirm, that her disease was smallpox. St. George's Church, where she was buried, was destroyed by a fire in 1727. The register of that church has this record: 1616, May 21, Rebecca Roth, wife of Thomas Roth, gentleman, a Virginia lady born, here was buried in ye channel. Yet there is no doubt, according to a record in the calendar of state papers stated 1617, 29 March, London, that her death occurred March 21st, 1617. End of Part 5. Read by Ellen Corcoran. Part 6 of The Story of Pocahontas by Charles Dudley Warner. John Rolfe was made Secretary of Virginia when Captain Argall became governor, and seems to have been associated in the schemes of that unscrupulous person, and to have forfeited the good opinion of the company. August 23, 1618, the company wrote to Argall, "We cannot imagine why you should give us warning that Opechancanough and the natives have given the country to Mr. Rolfe's child, and that they reserve it from all others till he comes of years, except as we suppose, as some do here report it, be a device of your own, to some special purpose for yourself." It appears also by the minutes of the company in 1612 that Lady Delaware had trouble to recover goods of hers left in Rolfe's hands in Virginia, and desired a commission directed by Sir Thomas Wyatt and Mr. George Sandys to examine what goods of the late Lord Delaware had come into Rolfe's possession and get satisfaction of him. This George Sandys is the famous traveler who made a journey through the Turkish Empire in 1610, and who wrote, while living in Virginia, the first book written in the New World, the completion of his translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses. John Rolfe died in Virginia in 1622, leaving a wife and children. This is supposed to be his third wife, though there is no note of his marriage to her, nor the death of his first. October 7, 1622, his brother Henry Rolfe petitioned that the estate of John should be converted to the support of his relict wife and children, and to his own indemnity for having brought up John's child by Powhatan's daughter. This child, named Thomas Rolfe, was given after the death of Pocahontas to the keeping of Sir Lewis Stukely of Plymouth, who fell into evil practices, and the boy was transferred to the guardianship of his uncle Henry Rolfe, and educated in London. When he was grown up, he returned to Virginia and was probably there married. There is on record his application to the Virginia authorities in 1641 for leave to go into the Indian country and visit Cleopatra, his mother's sister. He left an only daughter who was married, says Stith, 1753, to Colonel John Bowling, by whom she left an only son, the late Major John Bowling, who was father of the present Colonel John Bowling, and several daughters, married to Colonel Richard Randolph, Colonel John Fleming, Dr. William Gay, Mr. Thomas Eldridge, and Mr. James Murray. Campbell, in his History of Virginia, says that the first Randolph that came to the James River was an esteemed and industrious mechanic, and that one of his sons, Richard, grandfather of the celebrated John Randolph, married Jane Bowling, the great-granddaughter of Pocahontas. In 1618 died the great Powhatan, full of years and satiated with fighting and the savage delights of life. He had many names and titles. His own people sometimes called him Ataniac, sometimes Mamotonic, and usually in his presence, Wa-un-Senesac. He ruled by inheritance and conquest with many chiefs under him, over a large territory with not defined borders, lying on the James, the York, the Rappahannock, the Potomac, and the Pawtuxet rivers. He had several seats at which he alternately lived with his many wives and guard of bowmen, the chief of which at the arrival of the English was Werowomocomo on the Pamunkey York River. His state has been sufficiently described. He is said to have had hundreds of wives, and generally a dozen, the youngest, personally attending him. When he had a mind to add to his harem, he seems to have had an ancient Oriental custom of sending into all his dominions for the fairest maidens to be brought from whom to select, and he gave the wives of whom he was tired to his favorites. Strachey was making a striking description of him as he appeared about 1610. He is a goodly old man, not yet shrinking, though well beaten with cold and stormy winters, in which he hath been patient of many necessities and attempts of his fortune to make his name and family great. He is supposed to be a little less than 80 years old, I dare not say how much more. Others say that he is of tall stature and clean limbs, of a sad aspect, round fat visage, with gray hairs, but plain and thin, hanging upon his broad shoulders, some few hairs upon his chin, and so on his upper lip. He hath been a strong and able savage, sinewy, vigilant, ambitious, subtle to enlarge his dominions. Cruel he hath been, and querulous as well with his own quarrels for trifles, and that to strike terror and awe into them of his power and condition, as also with his neighbors in his younger days, though now delighted in security and pleasure, and therefore stands upon reasonable conditions of peace with all the great and absolute werowinces about him, and is likely more quietly settled amongst his own. It was at this advantaged age that he had 12 favorite young wives whom Strachey names. All his people obeyed him with fear and adoration, presenting anything he adored at his feet, and trembling if he frowned. His punishments were cruel. Offenders were beaten to death before him, or tied to trees and dismembered joint by joint, or broiled to death on burning coals. Strachey wondered how such a barbarous prince should put on such ostentation of majesty, yet he accounted for it as belonging to the necessary divinity that doth hedge in a king. Such is, I believe, the impression of the divine nature, and however these, as other heathens forsaken by the true light, have not that portion of the knowing blessed Christian spirit, yet I am persuaded there is an infused kind of divinities and extraordinary, appointed that it shall be so by the King of Kings, to such as are his immediately instruments on earth. Here is perhaps as good a place as any to say a word or two about the appearance and habits of Powhatan's subjects, as they were observed by Strachey and Smith. A sort of religion they had, with priests or conjurers, and houses set apart as temples, wherein images were kept and conjurations were performed, but the ceremonies seemed not worship, but propitiations against evil, and there seems to have been no conception of an overruling power or of an immortal life. Smith describes the ceremony of sacrifice of children to their deity, but this is doubtful, although Parsons Whitaker, who calls the Indians naked slaves of the devil, also says they sacrifice sometimes themselves and sometimes their own children. An image of their god, which he sent to England, was painted upon one side of a toadstool, much like unto a deformed monster. And he adds, their priests, whom they call Quackasos, are no other but such as our English witches are. This notion, I believe, also pertained among the New England colonists. There was a belief that the Indian conjurers had some power over the elements, but not a well-regulated power, and in time the Indians came to a belief in the better effect of the invocations of the whites. In Winslow's Relation, quoted by Alexander Young in his Chronicles of the Pilgrim Fathers, under date of July 1623, we read that an account of a great drought a fast day was appointed. When the assembly met, the sky was clear. The exercise lasted 8 or 9 hours. Before they broke up, owing to prayers, the weather was overcast. Next day began a long, gentle rain. This the Indians, seeing, admired the goodness of our God, showing the difference between their conjuration and our invocation in the name of God for rain, theirs being mixed with such storm and tempests, as sometimes, instead of doing them good, it layeth the corn flat on the ground, but ours in so gentle and seasonable a manner as they never observed the like. It was a common opinion of the early settlers in Virginia, as it was of those in New England, that the Indians were born white, but that they got a brown or tawny color by the use of red ointments, made of earth and the juice of roots, with which they besmear themselves, either according to the custom of the country or as a defense against the stinging mosquitoes. The women are of the same hue as the men, says Strachey, howbeit it is supposed neither of them naturally born so discolored. For Captain Smith, living sometimes among them, affirmeth how they are from the womb indifferent white, but as the men, so do the women, dye and disguise themselves into this tawny color, esteeming it to the best beauty to be nearest such a kind of murrey as a sodden quince is of, as the Greek women colored their faces, and the ancient Britain women dyed themselves with red. Howbeit, Strachey slyly adds, he or she that hath obtained the perfected art in the tempering of this color with any better kind of earth, herb or root preserves it not yet so secret and precious unto herself as do our great ladies their oil of talcum or other painting white and red, but they finely communicate the secret and teach it to one another. Thomas Luckford, in his Plain Dealing, or News from New England, London, 1642, says, they are of complexion swarthy and tawny. Their children are born white, but they bedaub them with oil and colors presently. The men are described as tall, straight, and of comely proportions, no beards, hair black, coarse, and thick, noses broad, flat, and full at the end, with big lips and wide mouths, yet nothing so unsightly as the Moors, and the women as having handsome limbs, slender arms, pretty hands, and when they sing, they have a pleasant twang in their voices. The men shaved their hair on the right side, the women acting as barbers, and left the hair full length on the left side, with a lock an ell long. A Puritan divine, New England's Plantation, 1630, says of the Indians about him, "Their hair is generally black and cut before like our gentlewomen, and one lock longer than the rest, much like to our gentlemen, which fashion, I think, came from hence into England." Their love of ornaments is sufficiently illustrated by an extract from Strachey, which is in substance what Smith writes. "Their ears they bore with wide holes, commonly 2 or 3, and in the same they do hang chains of stained pearl bracelets, of white bone or shreds of copper, beaten thin and bright, and wound up hollow, and with great pride, certain fowls' legs, eagles, hawks, turkeys, etc., with beasts' claws, bears, raccoons, squirrels, etc. The claws thrust through they let hang upon the cheek to the full view, and some of their men there be who will wear in these holes a small green and yellow-colored live snake, near half a yard in length, which crawling and lapping himself about his neck, oftentimes familiarity, he suffereth to kiss his lips. Others wear a dead rat tied by the tail, and such like conundrums. This is the earliest use I find of our word conundrum, and the sense it bears here may aid in discovering its origin. Powhatan is a very large figure in early Virginia history, and deserves his prominence. He was an able and crafty savage, and made a good fight against the encroachments of the whites, but he was no match for the crafty Smith, nor the double-dealing of the Christians. There is something pathetic about the close of his life, his sorrow for the death of his daughter in a strange land, when he saw his territories overrun by the invaders, from whom he only asked peace, and the poor privilege of moving further away from them into the wilderness if they denied him peace. In the midst of this savagery, Pocahontas blooms like a sweet wild rose. She was, like the Douglas, tender and true. Wanting apparently the cruel nature of her race generally, her heroic qualities were all of the heart. No one of all the contemporary writers has anything but gentle words for her. Barbarous and untaught, she was like her comrades, but of a gentle nature. Stripped of all the fictions which Captain Smith has woven into her story, and all the romantic suggestions which later writers have indulged in, she appears, in the light of the few facts that industry is able to gather concerning her, as a pleasing and unrestrained Indian girl, probably not different from her savage sisters in her habits, but bright and gentle. Struck with admiration at the appearance of white men and easily moved to pity them, and so inclined to a growing and lasting friendship for them. Tractable and apt to learn refinements, accepting a new religion through love for those who taught it, and finally becoming, in her maturity, a well-balanced, sensible, dignified Christian woman. According to the long-accepted story of Pocahontas, she did something more than interfere to save from barbarous torture and death a stranger and a captive who had forfeited his life by shooting those who opposed his invasion. In all times, among the most savage tribes and in civilized society, women have been moved to heavenly pity by the sight of a prisoner and risked life to save him. The impulse was as natural to a Highland lass as to an African maid. Pocahontas went further than efforts to make peace between the superior race and her own. When the whites forced the Indians to contribute from their scanty stores to the support of the invaders and burned their dwellings and shot them on sight if they refused, the Indian maid sympathized with the exposed whites and warned them of stratagems against them. Captured herself by a base violation of the laws of hospitality, she was easily reconciled to her situation adopted the habits of the foreigners, married one of her captors, and in peace and in war cast in her lot with the strangers. History has not preserved for us the Indian view of her conduct. It was no doubt fortunate for her, though perhaps not for the colony, that her romantic career ended by an early death, so that she always remains in history in the bloom of youth. She did not live to be painted by the contrast to which her eyes were opened between her own and her adopted people, nor to learn what things could be done in the Christian name she loved, nor to see her husband in a less honorable light than she left him, nor to be involved in any way in the frightful massacre of 1622. If she had remained in England after the novelty was over, she might have been subject to slights and mortifying neglect. The struggles of the fighting colony could have brought her little but pain. Dying when she did, she rounded out one of the prettiest romances of all, and secured for her name the affection of a great nation whose empire was spared little that belonged to her childhood and race, except the remembrance of her friendship for those who destroyed her people. End of the Story of Pocahontas by Charles Dudley Warner.